In this lecture, we will be examining the period known as Reconstruction, which was the attempt by the Union states to reform the South after the Civil War. There were a number of problems that needed to be addressed in the Reconstruction of the South. First, politicians attempted to define the exact nature of political and economic power for freed slaves. Just as important, though, was the nature of political and economic interactions between North and South. In addition, questions arose regarding what to do with Southern whites who supported the Confederacy during the war and how they would regain their status as citizens. It was unknown just how Southern whites would submit to efforts to assure the civil rights of ex-slaves. Finally, one of the major problems faced was political in nature. Exactly who would have the responsibility for Reconstruction, Congress or the President? In late 1863, Abraham Lincoln outlined a plan to reintegrate Southern states back into the Union. At the point in which 10% of the 1860 vote count from a rebel state took an oath of allegiance to the U.S. government and promised to accept emancipation for slaves, Lincoln's plan would then permit the state to rejoin the Union. Rebel states could then elect a state government and write a post-war constitution, but the state constitution had to contain provisions to permanently abolish slavery. By the end of 1864, the states of Arkansas, Louisiana, and Tennessee had created unionist governments that were acceptable by these standards. Unfortunately, the assassination of Abraham Lincoln in April 1865 ended this 10% plan. New President Andrew Johnson's plan required Southerners to take a loyalty oath. He called for the return of all property to Southerners, not including ex-slaves. But Johnson did not extend this provision to Confederate officials and extremely wealthy landowners. Voting rights were directly tied to the loyalty oath. However, Johnson proved to be much more lenient than Abraham Lincoln in dealing with ex-rebels. He issued pardons to almost any Confederate who asked for one. Johnson did not push for a requirement for Southern states to ratify the 13th Amendment, which was the official end to slavery in the United States. Johnson also ignored the passage of so-called black codes in the South, which severely limited rights for freedmen. Johnson also did not require that Confederate states renounce debts incurred by the war, leaving the federal government on the hook for those Civil War-era debts. The Republican-dominated Congress was highly agitated at what they viewed as treachery by Andrew Johnson. The Civil Rights Act of 1866 was a legislative response to the emergence of black codes in the South. The law defined all persons born in the U.S. as citizens. The act delineated the rights that all citizens possessed. Finally, the act named the federal government as ultimate final mediator in issues related to citizenship rights. States could no longer enact legislation that discriminated against ethnic minorities. However, Andrew Johnson's veto of the Civil Rights Act drove moderate Republicans toward the positions of radical Republicans. Radical Republicans pushed for a much more punitive and comprehensive approach to Southern states formerly in rebellion. They first demanded full citizenship and voting rights for freed slaves. Radical Republicans insisted that prior to readmission, Southern states needed to ratify the 14th Amendment. The Radical Republicans also called for a military occupation of the defeated Southern states. And one implicit goal of the Radical Republicans was to weaken the power of Southern plantation owners through the seizure and redistribution of land. This map shows the military reconstruction of the South in the period from 1866 to 1877. There were a total of 5 districts with commanding generals who made executive decisions, much like a dictator. The Ku Klux Klan was a secret organization formed in Pulaski, Tennessee in 1866 by ex-Confederate soldiers. The cartoon image accompanying this slide is from a Harper's Weekly edition in 1874. The image shows an African-American family stuck between a lynched corpse in a tree and the smoldering rubble of a burned schoolhouse, and the caption reads, "Worse than slavery." Most Klan members at the grassroots level were wage workers and farmers. However, the Klan had a leadership that included wealthy planters, influential merchants, and notable politicians. Members of the Klan hoped to bring about a return to white supremacy. They also sought to end Republican reforms in the South. The group used terror tactics to try to intimidate Republicans, blacks, and their supporters. Individual African Americans were widely targeted. In some cases, black churches and schools were attacked. The 15th Amendment was ratified in 1870. This constitutional change was in response by efforts by the Klan and other white supremacist groups in the South to terrorize black voters who wanted to exercise their right to vote. The amendment also came about in response to efforts by white Southern politicians to create legal barriers to voting by African Americans. The amendment forbid governments in the United States from denying a citizen the right to vote based on race, color, or what was termed previous condition of servitude or slavery. The Civil Rights Act of 1875 was a sort of last gasp for Reconstruction. The law banned racial segregation in public accommodations and in transportation, and it also outlawed the exclusion of African Americans from jury duty. The law was ruled unconstitutional in 1883 by the U.S. Supreme Court. The majority opinion held that the 14th Amendment does not forbid discrimination by individuals, only by governments. Victories by Democrats in state elections redeemed those states from the reforms instituted by radical Republicans. The cartoon in this image here depicts what artist Thomas Nast considered to be the three wings of the Democratic Party conspiring to deprive African Americans of their rights: working-class Irish, unrepentant Klan-supporting Southerners, and big-city financiers. These redeemers often profited, in political terms, from actions by the Klan and other terror-related groups. In the election of 1876, there were a total of 20 disputed electoral votes. 19 of these were in the states of South Carolina, Florida, and Louisiana, while one was in Oregon. The Democratic Party stopped backing nominee Tilden's claims to the electoral votes in exchange for an end to federal intervention in the South. This was known as the Compromise of 1877. To sweeten the metaphorical pot, the deal included federal subsidies for Southern railroads and canals. As a result of this compromise, the 1876 presidential election went to Rutherford B. Hayes, and Reconstruction effectively ended with this political campaign. To recap Reconstruction, slavery finally ended, but African Americans quickly lost most of the gains they had immediately won after the Civil War. True legal equality would not be regained until the height of the civil rights movement of the 1960s, a century or so later. The Confederacy was finally a ghost as Southerners regained status as citizens of the Union. The economy of the North, however, began to far outpace the economy of the South, and in a sense the South became an area of entrenched poverty and decline. And later on in the course we'll spend a greater time discussing the state of the South during the Gilded Age and the Progressive Era.